CBS News has confirmed Mark Sanford is mulling a primary challenge to President Trump. Sanford is the former governor of South Carolina. He also represented the state in Congress for nearly 12 years. Sanford has not committed himself to a run yet, but according to the Post and Courier, Sanford would try to push a national debate about America's mounting debt, deficit, and government spending. Here's what Sanford said about that earlier today.
There is little to no, I guess I'd say no discussion of debt, deficit, and government spending in Washington these days. I've watched 2 Democratic presidential debates, and there's been zero discussion on both of them as to this issue. The president has said we're not going to touch the very things that drive debt and spending. So I think that, we're walking our way into one heck of a financial storm, and there's no discussion, and yet presidential years have historically been the year in which we do discuss these things.
Let's bring in Emma Dumaine. She's a South Carolina correspondent for McClatchy. Emma, thanks so much for being with us. Mark Sanford, of course, is a former governor and congressman, but for people who may not remember, can you remind us of his history in South Carolina politics?
Yeah, so Mark Sanford was considered this rising star in Republican politics in South Carolina and nationally. He served 3 terms in Congress in the 1990s, came to the governor's mansion in the 2000s. People were thinking that he could run for president or be on the Republican presidential ticket, and then 2009 happened. He disappeared from the governor's mansion in Columbia. People weren't sure where he was. He told his staff that he was hiking the Appalachian Trail, supposedly. It turned out later he was having an extramarital affair with a woman from Argentina. The phrase hiking the Appalachian Trail has become a euphemism for having a secret affair. People didn't think that Sanford would be able to survive the political humiliation. He did end up serving out the remainder of his term as governor. And then in 2010, and then in 2013, he ran for a special election to retake his seat in Congress in the 1st Congressional District, which he served until 2018 when he lost his primary amidst an endorsement from President Donald Trump for his primary challenger, someone who was seen as more had more favorable things to say about the Trump administration than Mark Sanford.
Right, so let's talk about that a little bit. So during the midterm, Sanford did lose the Republican nomination for that seat in Congress, and at the time, President Trump had urged voters to reject Sanford, calling him, quote, nothing but trouble. And I know you reported on their, quote, testy relationship. Can you break down the history here between the two?
Yeah, so it started before the Republican primary for the congressional seat. Back in 2017, as Republicans in Congress were trying to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, Mark Sanford was very opposed to what House Republican leadership were proposing with the support of the president. At one point, so the story goes according to Mark Sanford, then OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, a former South Carolina congressman, told Mark Sanford, the president asked me to tell you that he would support a primary challenge against you if you don't vote with him on health care. That was in March of 2017.
Wow.
Almost a year later, Sanford continued to speak out when he disagreed with the president on policy, on politics, on some of his incendiary rhetoric. And the day of Mark Sanford's primary in June of 2018, that day, maybe I think around 4 p.m., as voters were still going to the polls, Trump tweeted that they should vote for Sanford's primary opponent, Katie Arrington. There's a lot of debate in the South Carolina political world about how much this factored in. There were a lot of discussions before and after about how Sanford had all this money but didn't really take his challenge seriously, that he didn't have enough of a ground game in South Carolina, that he was kind of taking for granted that he was popular among his constituents. There was a complacency that people pointed out, but it's certainly become a narrative, a mythology, that Trump's endorsement made a difference for Sanford, and it certainly didn't help him in those final hours as voters were heading to the polls.
So members of Sanford's own party in South Carolina are criticizing this move. The state's GOP chairman said today, quote, The last time Mark Sanford had an idea this dumb, it killed his governorship, end quote. So how big of an uphill battle could this be for Sanford if he decides to ultimately stage a run?
Well, he certainly wouldn't have support from the South Carolina Republican Party establishment. You know, Drew McKissick, the state party chairman, has made that perfectly clear. The governor, Henry McMaster, who, you know, has a good, long-standing, you know, a long history having a relationship, friendship with Mark Sanford, you know, was the first highest statewide elected official to endorse Trump during the primary, and many credit that endorsement as pivotal to him ultimately clinching the nomination in 2016. He's not going to turn his back on President Trump to support Mark Sanford. Members of the congressional delegation have a lot to lose in abandoning the president for their own local guy. You know, Lindsey Graham was golfing with President Trump over the weekend. Right. Tim Scott doesn't want to go there. So, you know, it's unclear where he would find the support in his own state.
All right, we'll continue to watch it. Emma Dumaine. Emma, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.